Now that I have my header and my footer complete, I can move on to the middle section with all my thumbnails. Now in this layout, I've arranged my thumbnails in columns. I have a container of width 1000 pixels from here to here, and within that I have 5 columns, each of width 200 pixels, and there I place the thumbnails in a column. Since I'm laying out my thumbnails in columns, I have resized all my thumbnails to be the same width so that they can line up nicely in columns. If I wanted to lay out my thumbnails in rows, I would have to make sure that all of them have the same height. If I wanted to have all my thumbnails the exact same size, as you can see, these original images are not the same size. So I'd have to do some resizing and cropping to make sure that all my thumbnails are the same size. So there are many different approaches to laying out your thumbnail grid. I've chosen columns. All my thumbnails are inside my images folder, which is within my website files folder. All my thumbnails are going to go inside my container div, which is inside my section. So let me look at what I have right now in my section. It's kind of hard to see in the design view because I don't have that much space, but in my code I can show you. This is my section right now. All I have is some placeholder text that says image thumbnails go here. I select this placeholder text and delete it. Now I make sure that my cursor is inside my section, and then I go to Insert Div at insertion point. So the new div is going to appear right in the section, and I'll give it a class of container, which is the same class I used for my header container and my footer container. So as you can see, inside my section I now have a div of class container and new placeholder text that says content for class container goes here. I will delete this text and replace it with my images. So for my images, I'm going to have 5 columns. Each column will be created as a div. So I'll delete the placeholder text. Make sure my cursor is blinking in the right spot, which is just inside the container div. And I'm going to insert a new div for the first column here. At insertion point, I'll give it a class. So I've added a new div of class thumbnail column. I'm going to have 5 of these divs. Inside this thumbnail column, I'm going to add the thumbnails that make up my first column. So once again, I will delete the placeholder text and then add my images. So as I insert the images, they start appearing here. I place my cursor just after my first image and then insert the next image. And so I go on inserting my images. So I've added the 4 images that make up my first column. As you can see here, my live view doesn't really show them laid out the way I want to. And in my design view, they just line up this way. I haven't added any styles for my thumbnail column. So now I'm going to do that. I click anywhere inside my thumbnail column div tag. Make sure I'm in style.css, and then add a selector. Dreamweaver gives me the selector .container.thumbnailColumn. I don't really need the .container part. I'm going to simplify my selector so all divs of class thumbnailColumn will get these styles. First, the width. You notice as soon as I do that, my images stack up in a column. Now my div has a width of 200 pixels, while my images have a width of 190 pixels. So I'm going to center my images within the div. To do that, I go up to the text properties and then choose text align center. As you can see, this centers my images within my div, which is that blue box, so you have an equal spacing on the left and right. I'm also going to take this entire div and float it to the left so that the next column can show up right next to it. So in my thumbnail column div, I go up to margin and say float left. So I have some issues here. First, my images show up after my logo, whereas I actually want them to show up below. And second, my footer is overlapping my column. I find the selector for footer. Now earlier I had set the position of the footer to absolute. Now it turns out that my content is going to be taller than the space that I have. I need the content to push the footer down and take up as much space as it needs. So I'm going to turn off the absolute positioning for the footer. Let's see what that looks like. So clearly that's not right either. Now my footer just shows up here stuck to my header. So what I need to do is ask this footer to clear my images and sit in the next line, not try to overlap my images. The way to do that is in the layout properties, let's just clear both so that it forces the footer to sit in its own row and not overlap with anything that comes before it. Okay, so now I have my header, my section, and my footer. And my section is pushing my footer down. I still need to get these images to line up where I want them. So going back to Photoshop, I need some kind of spacing above my thumbnails. I'm going to add some padding to give me some empty space and some breathing room above my content. I click on my section div and add a selector. Again, I don't need the word body because my section is always going to be inside my body. So I delete that and I have a simple selector called section. I want to give my section some padding at the top. About 75 pixels. Let's see how this looks. Now I can go in and add my other columns. So I click inside my container and my cursor is blinking just to the right of my first column. This is a good place for me to add my second column. So I'm adding a new div at the insertion point and it has the same class called thumbnail column. Now that I have these classes set up in my style sheet, I can just choose them from the drop-down. So here's another thumbnail column coming up. Dreamweaver's added some dummy text here. I'm going to delete the dummy text and start adding my images. I have 3 images to add in my second column. So I make sure my cursor is after the first image, insert the second, I'm going to save all and preview. So my layout is coming together, but I can see the spacing needs to be adjusted a little bit. I have more space between my columns than between my images, and I'd like to have some consistent spacing. I also need to add some space at the bottom to give me some breathing room below the thumbnails and above the footer. To do that, I'm going to add a bottom margin to add some breathing room between my thumbnails and my footer. So I go back to Dreamweaver, I'm on the section selector, and I'll add some bottom margin here. Let's see how that looks. So the margin isn't showing up, and the reason is that I have not specified a height for my section. The properties of margin and padding work along with the height that I specify to set the overall dimensions of the div. So I need to specify a height for my section. So now that I've added a height of 600 pixels, I'm sort of getting the spacing that I need. I can just tweak my margins and padding now to fine-tune the space that I need above and below my thumbnails. I can reduce the top padding slightly and reduce the bottom margin as well. Okay, that's better. Now I can go ahead and add my remaining columns and fix the spacing between my images. So here are my thumbnails. I just need to adjust the spacing between them. To do that, I need to build a selector in CSS that will select any image inside the thumbnail column. So to add this selector, I'm going to select one of these images, create a new selector, and see what I get. I get dot container, dot thumbnail column, and then img, which stands for image. Once again, all my images and thumbnail columns are going to be inside containers, so I can remove the dot container and just leave dot thumbnail column space image. So all images inside the thumbnail columns. And I'm going to give these images a small amount of bottom margin. And let's see how that looks. And there you have it. I have my thumbnail grid looking the way I want. Now I need to go in and link these images. Right now I don't have the other pages set up, so they're going to have dummy links as before. So to link an image, I just select the image and under properties I assign the link. Right now, since it's a dummy link, I'm going to just type hash. I'll go ahead and do the same for all the other images. Now I've assigned dummy links to all these images, and as you can see, when I mouse over them, I get the hand icon, which means they're acting like they're linked, although the links don't really go anywhere. So I'm going to add a bit of a style here so that when I hover over an image, something changes. So the effect that I'm going to add is a little bit of a drop shadow. So to add the drop shadow, I'm going to create a new selector for all these thumbnail images when the mouse is hovering over them. That selector is going to look very similar to my image selector, the one that I had used here to give it the bottom margin of 5 pixels. I select any of one of these images and I create a new selector. It says dot thumbnail column a image, and I'm going to add a hover at the end. So this selector will control the hover effect over the images. To actually add the effect, I'm going to add a drop shadow, and I'll find it under the background properties under box shadow. So the H and V are the horizontal offset and the vertical offset of the shadow. I'll set them both to 3 pixels and a blur of 3 pixels. And I'll choose a color of a medium gray. So now, when I hover over a thumbnail, I get a shadow, which makes this page look much more alive. And there I have my thumbnail grid.